Hello and welcome to the Minneapolis Foundation for a discussion on the state of Minnesota nonprofits. My name is Tom Weber. I'm the Senior Director for Special Initiatives here at the Foundation. We're excited to have you here. We're going to discuss and give a general outlook and talk about trends that are happening in the land of 10,000 nonprofits, as Minnesota is sometimes called. But we're also on the verge of what appears to be significant changes in public funding and policy. So let's discuss what might be coming and what philanthropy's role in all of that can and should be. There will also be a question and answer for your questions at the end. So go over to the chat part of this call and this webinar to drop a question. My colleague Maggie will be monitoring those questions. So we'll get to those later this hour. My guest here today that we're starting off with is Nonoko Sato, Executive Director of the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits. Thank you
Thanks for having
for
me.
being here. You've actually been talking about this a lot. So this is you're on a grand tour or something
That's right.
of
Yes.
talking
Yeah.
about this. We were talking, the council does something pretty unique, it seems, compared to other states. Not everyone does this, but you survey all of your members, try to get a sense of how nonprofit world is in Minnesota. So before we even talk about what might be coming policy-wise, before we talk about what election effects might be had, you were already in a place where you were talking about where nonprofit world was, even before the election. So what's the rundown
Yeah.
of that?
Yeah. No, we've been doing this survey called the Current Conditions Report since 2020, just right at the onset of the pandemic, just to see how things are going in the nonprofit sector. And we had decided to do it every year. Now we have our eighth iteration out right now that was published in 2024. So it gives us a sense of like what's been going on over the past couple of years, and a lot, obviously. And what we are noticing with the nonprofits are many of the organizations that provide direct service are seeing an increase in demand for services. So obviously things haven't slowed down. A lot of like mental health organizations, they are they're seeing an increase in demand for services. On the flip side, as the federal funding and relief funding has started to dry up, the income side has been also declining as well. So obviously, this is not very sustainable for nonprofits, and many of them are feeling like they're going to face financial distress in 12 months or less. And that particular percentage of nonprofits who have said that is increasing compared to even 2 years ago.
So is this a situation, and I know the survey itself only started in 2020, but just from what you've heard from people who have been in nonprofits for a long time, has this been a more unique moment than previous moments when things might have felt like we were at a pinch?
Yes, I think there is a unique circumstances around the fact that the pandemic really did change a lot. Within the nonprofit sector, we employ a lot of women. 75% of our nonprofit workers are women, which typically they hold disproportionate responsibilities at home. So we saw a large number of workers leaving our sector during the height of the pandemic, which for burnout reasons, retirement reasons, and they are starting to come back, which is great. But on the other hand, the nonprofits really did have to respond by raising wages, providing benefits. All those things are very, very good for our sector. We 100% support it. And that is also increasing their expenses as well. On top of that, I think inflation has certainly impacted our nonprofits. Just cost of doing business alone is just going up. Habitat for Humanity probably has more, they're spending more on, materials to build houses than ever before, or even just cost of printing, and all of those things are going up. So I think it is unique in that there were a lot of relief funding that was provided to nonprofits. And when that money is drying up, there isn't anything to replace it. And so I think nonprofits are having to make some sometimes difficult decisions around ways that they're operating their businesses.
Now, no way to replace it, but the demand for the service still there. It's nearly 75%
Yeah.
of the nonprofits you surveyed are facing increased demands for services. And then this is just one of the numbers from the report. How many months, this is the question, how many months can your organization operate in the current environment before you have financial distress? This most recent report, 79%
Yeah.
said less than 12 months. And in 2022, that was 47%.
Right.
That's an incredible jump.
Yes, it is. And I think, I mean, obviously, in many ways, nonprofits are sort of used to, having to deal with a very small budget or having a tight budget. Um, And when you think about that question, it is more a perception, perhaps, of the leadership of the organization. But I do think that that perception is really important, because if the executive director is saying, like, you know what, we are going to be in a very tight situation, we might have to make some difficult decisions, certainly that impacts the organization and, of course, the communities that they serve. But it is also impacting, I think, the burnout and the stress for the leader itself. And that is, I think, is going to be one of the biggest challenges, is understanding and supporting leadership and making sure that they have what they need in order for them to lead effectively. But if we're seeing, we haven't necessarily seen all that much yet, but if we're going to start to see more leadership leaving the sector simply because it's just too hard, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that would certainly harm the communities that we're trying to serve.
It's interesting. You also hear news stories every now and then, like, for example, food shelf
Yeah.
demand. When the pandemic started and there were people working from home and all of that, there was an increase in demand. And then there was also this emergency funding. And maybe folks, I don't know, maybe folks did or didn't think this, but as we came out of lockdowns and the worst part of the pandemic, you would think the demand might go down, but it really hasn't. At a place like Food Shelf, and what you're saying is it's not just food shelves, it's a bunch of different places
Right.
in different parts of nonprofit.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you also have to think about the fact that in certain rural areas, for example, if there's only one food shelter, that's the only place that you could probably go. So we do a lot of travel in Greater Minnesota, and we were talking to an organization that provides, food that's part of the work that they do. And the big thing right now for them is that they cannot recruit volunteers, because so workforce issue is certainly one thing, but also volunteers are a really critical part of our ecosystem. And when you can't recruit volunteers, they can't keep the food shelf open. And so this particular organization, they have to, one, allocate a certain amount of food on Monday, because otherwise it will run out before even Friday starts. They have to close that particular food shelf for a couple of days because they don't have enough volunteers to run it. And it's just this cycle over and over again as they're adding on more services that their communities are demanding. So that's one example of just the hardships around,
Yeah.
food shelf.
Well, but that's not all that's going on. We are now going to talk about how the election results, both nationally and at the state level in Minnesota, might affect that. What is your top level thought, or what are you hearing from folks about what may be coming for us very soon?
Yeah. Uh, there's so much. So I'm like trying to think of, like, so from a state perspective, right now, I do think that the public perception of this rampant fraud in our nonprofit sector is really harming our ability to be able to raise funds and to be able to do our work. Um, and it's really a few bad apples, few criminals who may have committed crimes. That doesn't mean that our entire sector is fraudulent. But that is something that we need to respond to. And more importantly, our sector really relies on public trust in order for us to be able to do our business. So regardless what happens at the policy level, we want to ensure that the public still feels trust in our sector. And I was just talking to you earlier about the Lilly School of Philanthropy. They had some sort of survey around the fact that only 5% of the general public think that they have been served by the nonprofit sector in the past year. And simply because maybe they didn't go to a food shelf, or they didn't, they weren't experiencing homelessness. But they forget that maybe their kids' childcare, those childcare, or their PTO, or the museums that they're taking their kids to, theaters, all those places are actually nonprofits as well. And so I do think that there needs to be some more communication around and awareness around the work of nonprofits and how critical we are to all of our day-to-day living. So that's on the state side. I think on the federal side, we don't know what we don't know, and I also think that we really need to be ready for the potential threats. And some of the threats that are coming our way potentially are cuts to federal agencies, whether that's like the IRS, for example, and or weaponization of those particular agencies against nonprofits. So recently, this bill, HR 9495, passed the House, and it was under this provision of, like, just trying to stop terrorism. So it sounds great in theory, but what it also included was one entity, the Secretary of Treasury, would have unilateral power to take away nonprofit status if they were deemed to be affiliated with a terrorist organization. There's no like, and there's no, and it's up to the nonprofit to defend themselves and to say like, "Oh, no, we're not part of, right?" And it is an example of potentially this new administration utilizing this power to silence organizations that they may not necessarily agree with. And I think that's a really huge danger to our democracy, to our ability to be able to do services. Um, we what
Well, and also to the point about the federal, like you talked about potential cuts in federal funds, like just cutting the
Yeah,
budget,
yeah,
which the incoming administration has basically promised
yes,
that they will do. So, how does that trickle down? What is the how do you draw the line between federal funding and nonprofits? I think there's some education to be done
yeah,
here that sometimes nonprofits actually administer
yeah.
the federal
And
funding.
honestly, I would flip that. I think the cuts from the federal agencies that are going and cutting into the safety nets of our communities. So it's less about, of course, like it's important for nonprofits to be able to have the funding available, but it is really the communities and the families and the Minnesotans who are going to be impacted by cuts to Medicaid and SNAP programs, which then in turn will, of course, increase demand for services for nonprofit sector that they were already facing anyway. And on top of that, if the nonprofits are no longer getting the funding that they need, whether that's through, through the federal government, uh, I mean, honestly, the math doesn't add, right? Like math is not mathing, essentially. So, yeah,
So the idea, so for example, a SNAP benefit for those to get food,
yeah,
if those were to be cut at the federal level, someone who lives in rural Minnesota
yeah,
who was able to get food through SNAP benefits would maybe have to go to a food shelf
yeah,
that can't be open every day because
exactly,
it doesn't have enough
exactly,
volunteers, et cetera,
et cetera,
et cetera, et
et cetera.
cetera.
Yes, yeah.
What else are you hearing from nonprofits about how they're preparing for what is still very much we just don't know?
Right.
What are the things being done now that you know of?
Um, we Well, I mean, there's also a threats to the work around equity, racial equity in particular. And so I think that there are conversations that nonprofits are having around like, do we even hide that word from our website? Do we even, and so there was a lot of effort to move forward issues around racial equity after the murder of George Floyd, and that's been great. There's been a lot of efforts to ensure, yeah, to just sort of bridge the disparities that exist between communities of color. And when this kind of threat is happening, if you're receiving a federal funding, can you or will you be able to do any of that work anymore? And I think that those are questions. And I think people are just much more reacting right now, and anticipating those challenges rather than necessarily like, oh, we have been attacked and therefore we can't do something. Um, and then also, like, I think people aren't necessarily thinking about, for example, potential cybersecurity threats. And so nonprofits, again, when we don't have the capacity and the resources, cybersecurity is not something that people are necessarily thinking about. But when you work with vulnerable populations that this particular administration has been targeting, LGBTQ folks, trans folks, immigrants, undocumented folks, um, what happens if the federal government comes and says, you know what, we're not going to give you money unless you give us all of your data around the people that you serve? And do you have to comply? So, to your question earlier, yes, like I think organizations that work with immigrants, for example, are working to understand what is their rights when ICE comes and knocks on the door and says, we're going to raid your nonprofit organization today. Are there ways for us to be able to stop that? I think understanding like just making sure that they have enough materials, like, and then to be able to talk about their work and the impact that their work is having on communities. I think that's also another critical aspect of that. Um, and ensuring, like, I mean, it's also like continuing to ensure that the workers have what they need in order for them to be able to continue to do the work, which means like they need to have the good benefits and the salaries to be able to recruit and attract talent. So those are things that's going to continue, hopefully.
Yeah, we're chatting here with Nonoko Sato from the Minnesota Council of
Nonprofits,
Nonprofits.
yeah.
We're the foundation. You're a nonprofit, and we're talking about the state of Minnesota nonprofits. And so now I'm going to bring in one of my colleagues here at the Minneapolis Foundation. Amy Pfarr is a philanthropic advisor. If you're a fund holder who's tuning in today, you you work with our advisors to help you have a greater impact with your own philanthropy. So Amy might be your advisor. So Amy, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Nonoko.
And you've obviously been hearing the conversation we're hearing, and I know you're interacting with our fund holders at the foundation who are just asking literally, what can I do? What can be done in this moment? So what do you say to that?
Right. It's not surprising that we're hearing that question of what can I do? How can I respond differently with my philanthropy? Because funders, our donors, they are important parts of that nonprofit ecosystem, right? They give their time, treasure, talent to really important missions. So when I hear that question of what can I do differently, I kind of bucket it and highlight three things. One is engage with curiosity. One is being trusting, and the other is really being responsive to the community's needs. So I'd love to kind of break those down,
Go for
because
it.
my hope for today is that those who tuned in today can kind of walk away with some tangible opportunities and things that do impact your philanthropy. So when I think about engage with curiosity, really it's understanding the ecosystem, right? Hearing what Nonoko is saying. So coming in today with that learning mindset is important and great, because when you hear things and learn the statistics of what the ecosystem is really facing, you're able to be informed and ground your charitable action in that knowledge, right? So hearing you say 3/4 of the Minnesota nonprofits are experienced increased demand, but kind of also increased costs, it allows our fund holders to just step back and say, gosh, I wonder how that's impacting the nonprofit that I support, right? So just engaging with curiosity and learning is so key in times like this. And then having empathy and understanding as you're engaging in that curiosity, because it's not normal times for our nonprofits, right? I think that report really highlights the challenges that nonprofits are experiencing. And then, of course, that second one is being trusting. As you engage in curiosity and be trusting, it's an opportunity to lean in and to trust those nonprofit leaders that are working so tirelessly on missions that are so critical to our community. So being trusting could look like giving unrestricted general operating dollars, right? Where you are saying to that nonprofit and the leadership, I trust that you are going to use these dollars where most needed, which I think is really important right now, because Nonoko talked about potential kind of federal cuts. And so to be able to have general operating dollars really allows folks to plug in where those dollars are most needed. So that is something that is a very easy, tangible thing our donors and fund holders can do. Certainly consider making multi-year commitments, right? In that trusting way. If you have nonprofits that you have relationships with for many years, doing multi-year commitments really allows them to plan and trust and understand better what revenue is coming in amidst of that time where other revenue might not be as stable. So communicating that to the nonprofit, being trusting, just building that trusting kind of ongoing relationship, trust and transparency. So communicating, hey, I'm going to make a one-time large gift this year because I see you're facing X, but I wanted to let you know that that's a one-time gift. So that transparency, I think, is really important. And then that last, kind of bucket that I often highlight is being responsive to communities' needs. And that is, right, you talked about inflation. I think that's the really great example of, right, we were walking through a food shelf. You guys talked about food shelves with a fund holder, and I heard the executive director say, I blew through our budget for eggs in the first quarter of the year versus what I would normally spend in the entire year. And so it is one for our fund holders to recognize that their $500 grant doesn't go as far as it did a year or two ago, right? It doesn't buy as many eggs, quite literally, for that food shelf. And so recognizing that now might be the time to increase some of your support, especially to the folks where you've been giving that consistent $500, $1,000 grants year after year. It's just an opportunity to kind of lean in. And then certainly, right, being responsive to communities' needs, I also think about equity and access to our neighbors. You mentioned a few of the kind of issue areas that will be hardest hit: LGBTQ plus, immigration, women's reproductive rights, right? And those are all issues that impact historically underserved neighbors and historically marginalized neighbors. So being responsive to the community's needs right now might mean jumping into an interest area that you've never funded before because you want to be responsive. And that's really where philanthropic advisors can kind of help folks explore those new issue areas. But those are the three things that I highlight a lot. And again, my hope is that to give some tangible sort of things that you can think differently about philanthropy.
Can I just add one more thing? I think, like, I mean, I think one of the big advice I can give is also just don't panic, because a lot of times when leadership is meeting with donors, for example, they want to put their organization in like the brightest light, right? Like everything is going great. But I really want to encourage our executive directors to really talk about the issues that they're facing and be honest with their donors. But in those instances, I think there's a fear that, like, oh no, if we say that we're in trouble, will our donors like no longer fund us? But I think, to your point, yes, like making sure that there's stability for the organization, I think would mean so much to them. And I think secondly, if you're on a board of a nonprofit, being an executive director or CEO, I think, of a nonprofit can be really, really lonely. And right now is a time that we need support for strategy. And this is something that I have with my current board, and I'm so grateful for that. Right before we were talking about like the impact of the federal election, for example, and because I have a constituent-based board, I just asked my board, like, what are the things that you're preparing for? These are the questions you're asking me, right? And so I got immediate answers from this wide range of nonprofit organizations that serve on my board throughout Minnesota, and that has been so helpful for me to, one, not feel alone, and then two, knowing that my board is supporting me. So I think, like, yeah, those are really important aspects of that.
It's interesting you talk about, Amy, the predictability too. I happen to know someone who worked at a nonprofit once, and every December they would get a $10,000 check from someone who obviously was able to give that, but they didn't actually know the person. Like, it was just like it showed up in the mail one day and then it happened the next year. And after a few years, it got to be the middle of December and they're like, are we going to get
Hope
that?
it comes in.
Is
Yeah.
it? We hope it comes in from this person we've actually never met. And those kinds of conversations, I mean, there's going to be a year when that doesn't happen, and that organization will be on tenterhooks potentially, and that's an interesting moment for that organization.
Right. Definitely. Again, it's the opportunity to be transparent in your charitable intent, right? And just sharing, like, or giving earlier in the year, so that nonprofit doesn't have to wait for the very end of the year to know what's coming in.
It is interesting to think a lot of times when a nonprofit engages with a person who might be a donor, it's the letter in the mail, it's the email to say, will you give to us? And I wonder if there's a little bit of education to be done that you're actually allowed to communicate back. You're allowed to talk back to that nonprofit too,
Sure.
and say,
Yeah.
these are my intentions with that giving.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think be aware of the fact that I don't think every single organization is going to be able to talk to every single
No,
donor.
true, yeah.
And that's part of the reason why the emails and the letter appeals are good. And at the same time, I think if you are a substantial donor and really want to understand how the nonprofit is being impacted by everything that's going around them, I do think that that's a really good conversation to have. And then hopefully it comes with like, and then how can I help, right?
Yeah. And I think that's really where the advantage of being connected to the foundation is having that philanthropic advisor, right? Who can set up those site visits for you, who can set up those conversations. And oftentimes, to be respectful to the nonprofit, we're doing it with multiple fund holders, right? So that they can learn from each other as they're learning and about that nonprofit. But we really value proximity to community as one of our core values. And so that connection, that interaction really does inform giving in a different way. It inspires people to give differently because they understand the needs better when they see it kind of firsthand.
Yeah.
We've been leaning in a little bit at the foundation at studying what seems to be, I don't know if it's a unique or a unprecedented trend, but there is with these pressure points financially, there do seem to be more nonprofits at least discussing things like consolidation, reorganization, merging, potentially even sunsetting or dissolution. What are you hearing from folks? Where is that conversation most helpful to be had as a community? Sometimes it just has to happen, but it doesn't always have to happen.
Yeah,
that kind
sure.
of a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and there's data that's available. It's not perfect, but there's data available from the Attorney General's office as well as Secretary of State. And I'm not going to get into the details of why it's not perfect yet. I think what's important to note is that what we were able to see the data, and we are seeing an increase in the number of organizations that are sunsetting. Now, at the height of the pandemic in 2020 and when George Floyd was murdered, there was an increase, an uptick in the number of nonprofits that started up because I think there were a lot of really good meaning people like, I'm going to save the world, and then quickly realized, oh, it's really, really hard to run a nonprofit, which I think is another reminder to your donors. It's like, it's really hard to run a nonprofit. But I don't think that we know that that alone does not account for the rise in the number of sunsetting organizations. In fact, the average year, the tenure year of an organization is increasing. So more established organizations are potentially closing their doors. With that said, I think sunsetting doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. And sometimes it's a necessary business decision. What I do think is an issue right now is that a lot of resources that are out there, many organizations are planned hopefully like years in advance around when to sunset, right? Like it's an intentional sunset because hopefully, ideally, they met their mission and that would be a beautiful thing. What we're hearing from our nonprofits who are considering these kind of mergers and consolidations are, we need to do this in the next 6 months because we just don't have the money. The cash flow is just not meeting those demands. Are there any resources? What is it that we need to do? And those are actually coming also from volunteer board members, because they are the ones responsible for having to like manage all of that.
And to clarify, you're talking about one-time costs
Yes.
that an organization needs to achieve
Yes.
the merger or the dissolution.
Exactly.
You can't just close the lights one day. There are
And then hopefully like it's gone. Yeah.
there are added costs in this few month period that you have to
Right.
bear, and that's where they're looking for those.
Right. I mean, the donors have given money. So if there are any assets left over, you also have to make sure that the donor intent is being met. So what do you do with that extra financials? How do you make sure that you're supporting your staff so that, they can also help sunset the organization? Yeah, so they are potentially big one-time costs. But I also think I just want to make sure that it's not a panic moment, right? It's just like it's an intentionality around it. Same thing with mergers and consolidations. We are not seeing as many of that, but I'm sure that it's not even I'm sure. I have talked to folks who are considering that with similar organizations.
So Amy, how can fund holders be responsive to that part of the world and that part of the business?
Yeah, I totally agree with Nonoko that those moments of sunsetting or mergers or even the need for capacity building dollars, right? Those are not moments to turn away from a nonprofit, right? It's really moments to turn toward with that sort of curiosity and understanding. The best example that I have is I had a fund holder call me last month and say, "Hey, Amy, I've already given my gift already this year for this nonprofit. I just learned that it's their last season. After 40 years of serving the Twin Cities community, they need to close. But they've been really transparent with me about what their fundraising needs are as they sunset. They've been really transparent about, we want to have this last season of this arts show because we want to honor what we've done in the community. And so I want to triple my gift." What a great example of, again, turning toward in those moments of closure, sunsetting, and just helping that happen really with empathy and understanding that there is going to be more of that, and it's opportunity to be curious and lean in and not move away. Because I think that you had said it before, it's just very much a natural sort of thing for a fund holder to go, no, I don't want to support something that's closing. Right. But in these times, it's opportunity.
Or to think that, oh, well, it's closing, they'll be closed in a week, so there's nothing more to do. Maybe
Right.
that's also
Right.
a moment for
Exactly.
education.
Yes, exactly. And in this instance, the fund holder really was told very transparently, like, this is what we need in order to close the last season.
Um, uh, it's always a tricky conversation, right, to be had about that, because you want to assume that this will go on forever. And maybe it's when you're starting the nonprofit, it's to don't actually assume we're going to be around forever. Think of this as a 5-year organization or a 10-year organization, and then go from there. I mean,
Yeah.
I almost wonder about the education on the front end and
Oh, I mean, we have a starting our nonprofit. training, and I think one of the first questions we ask, like, are you sure you want to start a nonprofit? Like, have you looked at the landscape out there? Maybe you should support those organizations instead. But yeah, and I also think that we're a unique sector in that many of us are working towards a world where we don't have to exist. Maybe not arts organizations, and also please support the arts. Go see shows and theaters. They are struggling right now as well. But yeah, I mean, like we want to end hunger and homelessness. We want to make sure that we have thriving communities. And yeah, if we're able to achieve that, then we wouldn't have to be here, you know? So we'll just have to be a Minnesota Council of Arts and Hospitals and educational institutions.
You know, it's also interesting in this that the word advocacy is sometimes it makes people even nervous,
Yes.
frankly, in nonprofit world. But you've talked a lot about how there really is a need to lean into advocacy and to differentiate advocacy from what we might think of as direct lobbying, for example. What is that 101 lesson, for example?
Yeah, and we've been trying to educate our nonprofits as well, because even though as a state association we do have a lobbying and advocacy arm, we can't do everything, and we are not issue specific, nor are we experts on specific issues as well. And so what we're trying to encourage our nonprofits to do is to understand that educating your lawmaker about the work that you do is not lobbying. Because I know that it's so intimidating. I mean, I was told as a young executive director in my last organization, like, you are not supposed to do anything political. And so I never did it. And no one ever taught me, like, no, you actually can do X, Y, and Z. And then in hindsight, I'm like, I had all this expertise around what students really, like students from low-income communities really need in order for them to thrive in their schools and go to college. But that is not something that I was able to do in terms of political work. And so yes, like I think part of it's like educating nonprofits and making sure that they have the tools and the messaging that they need to talk to their representatives about the work that they do and how critical they are to the communities that these representatives are representing. And then also I think donors can also do that as well. Like, you are represented by your your elected officials, and calling them and saying, look, like, this is the reason why this organization really needs to exist. Here are the ways that they're doing this work. I think that kind of educational relationship with elected officials would be really huge for us right now.
And remind me, is there a particular limit or ban on a nonprofit as an entity from doing direct? What is the rule? Like, what is it?
Oh, I am going to have
as best you know. As best you know.
Yeah. No, there are certain limits in the amount of funding that you can spend towards lobbying efforts, and those are actual. Submitting a bill and actually like signing onto a bill and lobbying for that to pass. We cannot, as a 501c3 entity, so nonprofits are broad in our categories, but the C3s, which are a majority of us, we are not able to endorse candidates, for example. Now, going back to the federal administration, there is a danger right now of the Johnson Amendment, which protects the nonprofit's ability to be nonpartisan, being pushed against, to be dismantled, which I think will really harm our ability to be able to do civic engagement work and making sure that we are nonpartisan. We're here to support the community. We don't necessarily have a particular political agenda, and that we want to be able to work on both sides of the aisle to make sure that our communities that you are all representing can thrive.
So just to hone on, especially for folks who are watching, who are individuals, right? Anyone can go to the Capitol. It's your house, it's the people's house, and say, you're my legislator. I think you should know more about food shelves. And as an individual, you can say, I also think you should pass this one bill because it would give more money for food shelves. You can, as an individual, anyone can say anything they want to a legislator. Yeah. There is a little bit of a difference between someone in, for example, your position going to the Capitol and saying, I just want to let you know these are the 5 things you might not know about this issue.
Yes.
Versus, I want you to pass this specific
Yes, please
bill.
sign on to this bill.
Please sign on to this bill. And so that's the place where you would want to work with your nonprofit to
Exactly right.
know exactly what you can.
And I think there's also, I'm not sure, but I think that there might also be a little danger around, like, if you're a volunteer of an organization, you're representing the organization, that's a little bit different than an individual who deeply cares about
The
this
thing.
particular issue. Yeah.
Right. What have you heard from fund holders? Has that come up? Has this idea of how can I be out there advocating for this more, not just with my dollars, right? With the
Right.
work that
Right.
you do as an advisor.
Yeah, there's always that question of how to direct dollars, right? Directing dollars to direct services or directing dollars to advocacy that kind of creates that systemic change and really supports. So I think it's a lot of just individualized conversations with fund holders to ask, where do you want to have an impact? And then I believe Maggie's going to put in the chat the opportunity to sign up for kind of the uh, advocacy alerts, just to be aware of these are the heavy hitting sort of issues and policies that are impacting nonprofits so that they can kind of continue to monitor and then do exactly what you said, Tom. Reach out to your legislator and be vocal about the importance of nonprofits in community.
And to the note here for folks watching online here, all of the links that Maggie is putting in the chat, we're going to do a follow-up email. There's going to be a survey, so keep in touch with us for sure as well. I'm actually getting a few questions that are coming from folks who are watching. Nonoko, to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, to what extent has the end of COVID-related emergency funding caused or even exacerbated crisis? And is this the result of some nonprofits not having sufficiently planned for the idea that this money might one day go away?
It's a very broad question, so I am not going to say like every single nonprofit did X, Y, and Z, but I do think that the federal funding, relief funding, we were able to retain our workers as best as we can during the time where we did not know where our money was going to come from. And so that is the purpose. So that was one of the purposes of the PPP loans, for example. Um, and and I think that's really important. Like, we were able to retain the staff that we need as best as we can. And no, I do think that nonprofits really did know, but it is extremely hard to plan because without knowing where the funding might come from, and we're always sort of doing our best guess when we're doing our budgets. Some more than others, and I think it also depends. Like, if you don't have a diverse funding strategy, so if only your money is coming from one particular source, well, that could put you at risk as well. On the flip side, if you have very diverse funding, it might actually be good in the long run, but then it requires more resources from the organization to be able to manage all of those, because grant writing is extremely different from individual major donor cultivation. And so those are two different skill sets. I think I'm also hearing from some nonprofit leaders around, like, where do I invest? So one of the things about the current conditions report was that we saw a number of organizations that really invested in their fundraising strategies because of this moment. Sounds like a good, smart business decision. Of course, you want to raise more money, you want to invest in that. Well, the challenge is, of course, that nonprofits are always penalized for having too much overhead. So, and fundraising is considered overhead. And funders love to give directly to programs. So in my last organization, I worked with kids, and they want that money to go to kids, not to my salary. But on the other hand, like, well, then who is overseeing, right, the organization? Who is making sure that the funding is coming in? So I think that there's a larger conversation we need to have about overhead. And no matter what, like, you can plan all you want, but ultimately, if the increase in demands for service, you can't predict inflation rates the way that it was, especially. And suddenly you're blinking and like, oh my gosh, like, I need to provide benefits for my staff, and we haven't been able to offer that before. We need to make sure that we're competitive in the market, and we're super under market compared to the for-profit sector. So I think that there are a lot of things that were just beyond the nonprofit's control. So I would be really hesitant about, this blame is not the right word, but just like saying like, well, it's because you didn't plan any better. Right. I think in this given situation, I think it's always going to be hard no matter how much you planned for it.
Another question from the chat has to do with, there are entities like corporations, foundations, and the like that do support nonprofits, and then over time for their own maybe reasons, maybe they start decreasing the contribution, or they change their focus,
Sure.
right? Those kind of, sometimes it can be a little bit of a whiplash,
Sure.
like all of a
Yes.
sudden I'm going to go over to this area.
Yep.
Is there any effort on an organization like yours as part to go to those entities and say, we'd like to educate you on the effects you're having when you do something, especially if you do something too quickly? Is that are you trying to go back that way in the conversation as well?
I think that's an ongoing conversation. I don't know if it's just like this moment in
Yeah.
time. And of course, again, going back to donor intent, donors are allowed to do that. That is absolutely okay. And I wonder, there are, I think, better ways to be able to like switch your funding. So rather than, to your point, having a whiplash of like, I was supporting youth education, but now I want to support agriculture next year. Well, that doesn't really, this actually happened to me. So like this example, that, like that suddenness of losing that particular funding, I think can be really, really hard for a nonprofit. So are there ways for you to like slowly and gradually lower your funding? Yes, like educating. I mean, we do presentation with the Minnesota Council of Foundations all the time. We also work really closely with them, fortunately, in terms of our policy agendas and all of that. So yeah, we do try to educate folks around issues that nonprofits are facing. But I think, yeah, it's an ongoing battle.
Does this come up in your conversations at all about the idea of, well, maybe we want to go a little slower if we want to move away from something or something like that?
Yeah, certainly. I think every year we're working on building giving plans with our fund holders and thinking about what are those interest areas. And yes, if it's one where it's changing, then to be, again, going back to transparent and communicative to the nonprofit about potential changes. And also, again, I think now is an awesome time to take a look at a new funding area, right? A new focus area. Again, we anticipate that there'll be some hard hit sort of issues. And so it's an opportunity to add to what you give and maybe not subtract.
I think, I mean, we're also operating in this like zero sum game. Like if you get the money, then I don't get the money. And I think that there's something to be said around there's an abundance of resources that we can provide. And I think we should go for that. And then also, secondly, the Minnesota Council of Foundations also do their giving report, and they've noticed that a lot of the donations coming from Minnesota organizations are going outside of the state. So 50% of the funding, according to their research, is going outside of the state. Also, only 8% of funding is going out to rural communities in greater Minnesota, even though I think they account for like 15 to 20% of the population. So there's definitely disparities that we need to be able to address.
The survey question from the chat here, Nonoko, did the survey or your conversations reveal changes in the ways that organizations are seeking support? Individual donor versus maybe trying to get a state grant or a contract of some kind. Are they rethinking that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the wonderful aspect, I think, of the nonprofit sector is their creativity. I hate to use the word resilience because then my question is like, what do they have to be resilient from, and why aren't we addressing that to begin with? So that's a whole other conversation. But yes, I think they are trying to be creative in ways that they are trying to get funding. But that also requires investment into the organization's foundation, like capacity to be able to do that. And they are having to make some choices. I know an executive director, for example, who wanted a director of development for the first time for this exact reason, and realize that they can't afford that person. So they cut their own salary to bring in the development director who's paid more than the executive director who's overseeing the entire organization. Again, that's their decision. And if that's the way that they have to do it, I guess that's okay. And at the same time, like, is this really the sustainable business model that you should be following, right? But yeah, I mean, director of developments, they're expensive for a reason. I would also mention that specialized skill sets around human resources and finances it's really needed right now. And it is also extremely hard to recruit for because they're specialized and it's extremely hard to afford them.
There's a question online, Amy, about what you had mentioned about multi-year grants. Can you just say a little more about why they're important. What do you say to folks when they express interest, and why it's important, especially now?
Yeah, it is important because it allows that nonprofit to understand and know that a multi-year commitment is coming from a fund holder. And I think it's a really sort of easy thing to do when it's a nonprofit that you've given to year after year after year. But just from that vantage point of the nonprofit being able to know and plan and kind of steward you as a fund holder differently, right? When I was in my fundraising days as the director of development, right? It was knowing that they were going to be committed a multi-year gift allowed me to just keep them updated and keep them close. But we had that relationship of understanding and knowing. And so that transparency of multi-year commitment is really important. And also the communicating side, and that your philanthropic advisor can communicate that for you if you don't have that close of a relationship, but you still know that you want to support them with a multi-year commitment.
I would also add, though, just like keep in mind the inflation rates, because a
Yes.
$10,000 donation 3 years ago is not the same as it is today.
Agreed.
And I also think it's important, like multi-year commitments are wonderful, and the way that we have to list it on our financials, it makes it look like we have a lot more money if you don't understand restrictions. So again, like a philanthropic advisor would be a really good one, to talk to, like, does this organization really have this much money, or is it a multi-year grant that you had to record as an asset on your balance sheet? Yeah.
What is the foundation and or the Council on Nonprofits, so this is to both of you, doing to support what we were talking about earlier about things like merger activity when it's necessary for those one-time grants? Is that something
Yeah.
your organization is working on?
I mean, there are so many things that we need to
So
work
many things you're
on.
working on, yes.
But yes, I think one of the best things that we are able to do is to be able to consolidate and collect resources. So less about particular around mergers, but what we are looking for, and if you actually have information on this, we would love it, are legal resources that might be available for nonprofits. So there are places like Legal Corps that exist, which is great, but I feel like they're going to be overburdened with inquiries. But everything from legal compliance and making sure that your employee handbook is up to date. If you have to merge or if you have to, you do need a lawyer for that. So are there pro bono and or low cost legal support services that are available? And so what we can do as a state association, because we get those calls all the time, is to say, like, here's a resource that you can go to, rather than us like taking ownership of something that an organization is already doing.
Yeah, I can think of two things. One, we're planning a learning collaborative, learning opportunity around sunsetting for nonprofits and just what have we seen, how can that be done kind of successfully. And the other thing I would point to for the foundation is our One Minneapolis Fund. And so that is our nimbly responsive, based on the community's greatest needs. And so for the last few years, that fund has been focused on grant making in housing. But as we go into this year, we're really looking at it. Our amazing community impact team is really looking at it of how can we utilize those grant dollars to support the greatest needs that are popping up within nonprofits. So certainly part of that conversation may be sunsetting and mergers and acquisitions. So I encourage folks to kind of stay tuned on what that focus of the One Minneapolis Fund will be, but it's that opportunity for our fund holders to have collective impact, because you can grant your dollars into that fund and then collectively get granted out into the community to support kind of the greatest needs. And we know that's certainly part of the conversation being looked at.
And that's the thing, is like every organization is unique. And so, like the types of support and the types of information and questions that they might have might vary. And so that kind of responsive funding is really great. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and as we bring our conversation to a close, this is hopefully just a start, to your point, Amy, of a broader conversation as well. There are a lot of unknowns, so hopefully we've set a good foundation for what you need to know. As we wrap up, Amy, how will the Minneapolis Foundation continue to support our fund holders' understanding and philanthropy as we navigate what is to come?
What's to come? Yeah, agreed that today is just the start, right? We just started the opportunity to learn and be curious and understand what the ecosystem is facing. And we know it's going to take all of us, really all of us, to to address what will come, because no one person, no one entity, no one foundation or nonprofit can solve all of what's coming. So because we know it takes all of us, we're really intentional about our engagement and learning opportunities that we have slated for 2025. If those fund holders that tuned in, if you have your Giving Matters e-newsletter, I encourage you to open that up because it has a slate of amazing learning opportunities for the first half of the year. Came out earlier this week. It's one you don't delete. Don't delete. So because we have things like a pop-up giving circle planned for May. So on immigration. So 90 minutes, come and learn about the issue, learn about what we've learned so far by May of the impacts of administration, pool your dollars together and grant out. So 90 minutes of learning, granting, and impact. So many opportunities like that that are planned, opportunities around education. I mentioned the Learning Collaborative on sunsetting. We just really value, again, that proximity to community. And so we're a convener of community, right? We're trying to intentionally support our fund holders by making those opportunities available to connect with the nonprofits, the leaders who are doing amazing work day in and day out, and then also convene with other people who are interested in some of those same issues. So you can learn from each other's kind of giving journeys. So it is one where lots of things planned for the year. And of course, lean into your philanthropic advisor, right? We are here and excited to support and help because it is a challenging ecosystem that our nonprofits are facing, and our fund holders are an important part of that. So we are here, and we're here with gratitude too, because we know that the generosity right now is so critical in our community.
All right, Nonoko, what gives you hope? This has been a heavy conversation. There's a lot out there. What are you hopeful about?
No matter where I go in the country, there are such incredible people who are doing really impactful work. And I think we need to continue to remember that there are always people who are going to be fighting for the right side of history and making sure that our communities and our people and the things that are important to us continue to thrive. I love I'm a theater geek, and so I love going out to see shows because it is a way for us to be able to learn about other people's stories and, to be able to open our perspective and to be able to share that experience with other people. I think that kind of like the arts are so critical right now, and oftentimes when funding is really tough, like in schools, for example, those are the first ones that get cut, right? And I can't leave this conversation without like really encouraging, please like go see a theater show. I think it's the people, like the people that I get to meet every day, regardless of all the different struggles that they're going through. At the end of the day, they wake up in the morning and go to work and in service to community, and that continues to inspire me daily.
Well, I want to thank both of you for this conversation. Nonoko Sato, Executive Director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and Amy Pfarr Walker, our Philanthropic Advisor here at the Minneapolis Foundation. Links that were in the chat will be sent in a follow-up email. There's also a survey that we'll ask you to fill out. And please connect, if you're a fund holder, with your philanthropic advisor to debrief what we talked about here today and talk about your own next steps. So thanks for joining us, and have a great day.